Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to a slightly different video. And so today I am here with the author Mabli Roberts, who wrote God's Children. Some of you may remember over the last month or two that I've mentioned this on my channel a couple of times. I read this a few months ago and absolutely loved it. This is a historical fiction novel focusing on a woman called Kate Marsden, who was an actual historical figure. She was a nurse in the 19th century who went on various kind of expeditions looking for a cure for leprosy, which is absolutely fascinating, and this book looks at it really interestingly. So Mabli has very kindly come to London to do an interview with me, and we're going to talk a little bit about the book and various things that inspired it. I think if we try and keep it relatively spoiler-free, so that anyone who hasn't read it can still enjoy the book. But I mean, obviously, she was a real person. We can talk about her life. But yeah,
it's out there.
Yeah. So we are today in the Society of Authors, who are effectively the union for authors, and they have very kindly lent us a room to film in today. So I think the first thing we're going to talk about is sort of Kate Marsden as a historical figure, and what made you choose to write about her.
Well, I've always been interested in people that have made really long journeys or challenging trips, polar explorers, people who've gone places nobody's been before. I don't know why, I don't travel at all, perhaps that's why I could barely get here. And during my just sort of general reading, I discovered this person called Kate Marsden, who had made this incredible trek across Siberia in 1891. Which just completely caught my imagination. And then the more I read about her, the more interested I became. She is part of the Long Riders Guild, which is a society that recognises people who have done a trek. I think it's over 1,000 miles. So, I mean, didn't exist when she did it, but she ended up in that. So that's where I found her when I was just reading around the subject, because I did a month-long trek around Wales myself on a horse. I wrote a book about it. So that was how I found her when I was just looking at that, really. But I've always been interested in people who do those sort of intrepid things, because I'm not intrepid.
Yeah. And in terms of Kate Marsden's life, because she did have a fascinating life, what would you say was one of the most sort of interesting things you found out about her, or you really enjoyed writing about?
Well, obviously to start with the trek itself, because it took nearly a year and it covered such amazing terrain, and it was winter and summer and all that, but also because she wrote a book about the trek, and of course that was my first point of research, was to read her book. But what came across it to maybe a more modern perspective was what she wasn't saying. I felt like the subtext was really loud, and she was presenting a version of herself and a version of events that seemed very guarded and careful and measured, and I thought, well, what else is going on here? And because I write historical fiction anyway, I was aware of the social context that she travelled in, so that made me start to investigate a bit further, and then gradually I found out that actually she led quite a notorious life.
And so for those of you who haven't read God's Children, one of the things that I found really interesting about it and so fascinating is sort of Kate's relationships with women, and she had various romantic relationships with women, and this was kind of exposed later on in her life, and was used to kind of discredit her medical research as a nurse. Did you find that really interesting? Kind of, how did you find out about that? How documented is that?
Well, because there's none of that in her own book.
Yeah, of course.
She was a very religious person. Gay women just weren't recognised even as existing in 1891. It wasn't illegal to have female same-sex relationships because
considered to be a thing.
Yeah, it didn't exist, so you didn't need to legislate against it. I think that's how the thinking went. But we were all around the time of the Oscar Wilde trial and things like that later on when her book was coming out, and she was very aware of how much scandal could be attached to her personal life. I mean, if anyone's read anything about other women explorers of the time, you'll know that they often faced a lot of resistance to what they were doing. They were entering a man's world, they were doing something that went against the perceived idea of what a woman should be like and how she should behave. And a lot of people found that quite threatening. So it wasn't unusual that she should face that sort of conflict. But because of her sexuality, it just made her completely beyond the pale, really. And in fact, with the characters that I've got in the book, the main character, the main love interest, if you like, for Kate, who's Rose, is pretty much the only central character that I completely invented.
Okay. Yeah.
Because all the others have some basis in real people that existed. But of course, if there was, and we know she did have relationships, and those are detailed in the book as well. Yeah. But I felt that there would have been more. Yeah, there would have been someone else.
Do you find it very different when you're writing about the fully fictional characters in this book or in other things you've written in comparison to writing about a person who really existed?
It is different. I don't know if it's easier or more difficult, but it is different.
Yeah.
I think with a fictional character that's completely your own invention, you've got free rein to let your imagination go. You can be creative, you can absolutely decide on everything about that character. But then again, you've got to make the whole thing up, so it's hard work. If you've got a person who has already inspired you or intrigued you, that's a great start point, but then you have to feel that you are being true to that character. You have to maintain an honesty that you believe. You can't know everything, that's the first thing, so you still have to invent. You still have to imagine the gaps and paint with real detail all those things that you can only really guess at, but that's really great. And I think one of the nicest compliments I had about this book was there's a polar explorer you may have heard of called Felicity Aston, which actually gave me a nice little quote on the book, and we've become friends because she has an interest in Kate Marsden, and she actually went across Siberia doing the same trek herself. And she said that although she knew an awful lot about her, she's been to the Kate Marsden Museum, all these things, she never really felt she knew her until she read this book. And then now she feels like she knows the person, which was lovely. I think she'd come to life.
And as well, because yes, this book is about what Kate did, but it's also about Kate's internal life and how she feels, and especially about her religion and the conflict she feels inside sometimes between her religion and her sexuality. And that, I think, is so well realised. You can't get that from an account of her life. And I think the way you have created her into a kind of full being in this is wonderful. And that's something I really enjoy about it. Yeah.
That's really nice to hear. It was a conflict for her. She was a very religious person, but she didn't really live a very religious life. And she actually changed from being a Protestant to a Catholic and back again, I think, at some point. And she was trying to, I think, fit in, but couldn't fit in. She didn't fit into society as it was. She didn't fit into the idea that the church had of how she should be and how even other women viewed her at the time. So, you know, it brought her into conflict with her own family. She was very close to her mother. A lot of her family died of TB. She was orphaned when she was about 11. Her father died. So she felt responsible for her mother in her later years. And of course she couldn't discuss it with her mother. She couldn't come out to her mother. So her mother never understood why she didn't just get a husband. Why don't you marry? Why are you so resistant to the idea of getting married? Because we need someone to look after us. So she needed to earn a living to keep them. She needed to find, and she was a nurse, and nurses, you know, weren't terribly well paid. No change there. And for her, that option of getting married, she couldn't reconcile herself to that. So part of the trouble, the scandal that she had was levelled at her that she was doing this for her own gain. That she was doing it to make money, to become famous. To sell her books, to make money. In fact, the money she made from her books went into the foundation to build the hospital. But it's true that she needed to make money. You know, it definitely was a consideration that she couldn't really support herself and her mother and her ailing sister and everybody else on a nurse's wage.
Another thing that I really like about God's Children is that it's not a linear narrative. There's at least sort of 3 strands which are woven together. Which I really enjoyed. I always like books that kind of play with different narrative structures. What made you choose to write it in that particular way? Because it's not the sort of most obvious way to write it, but actually it works.
I did ask myself that several times during the writing process. Well, first of all, I wanted to avoid writing a snowy epic. I mean, I liked snowy epics, but that wasn't what I was setting out to write. I wanted to try something that was structurally a bit more challenging for me to write, because by the time I wrote this book, I'd probably written 11 books, and I wanted to be more experimental and try something different. I think also because I look at it when I'm writing it with the position we have is Kate looking back on her life,
Yes.
remembering things. She's affected by dementia. She's not going to remember things in a linear way. And we don't, you know, when we remember things, we remember vivid snatches, often out of sequence, and if somebody asks us about it, we'll backtrack. And so I thought that was helpful to remind us that we're looking at this all through, you know, her recollections. The other thing is that I see it as quite a filmic book. I don't know how you found it, if it was quite a visual book.
Yeah, and I would say especially the fact that there aren't dates every time you move time, but I always knew whether it was before or after what had come
Very
before.
relieved to hear that.
But I don't know how I knew. Like I can't work out the craft of how you did that. But I think it is partly here's the scene, I know where we are in this scene, and therefore I can place it in the narrative. Which I think is to do with it being sort of cinematic and you in the same way.
That's what I was banking on, was the fact that we actually, when we watch a film, we don't question that.
No.
Films tend to chop and change. We watch a scene here, then we go back, then we go forwards, then we're somewhere else, with different points of view, and we move around and we just make sense of it. But when we read a book, we are still really expecting chapters and a linear narrative, even if we have flashbacks. So because I was writing it in a very filmic way, and then I have in fact written it in scenes, it enabled me, because I've actually written the screenplay as well, and I was writing it at the same time, and you have that flexibility with the screenplay to move things around. I think, well, actually, cinematically and from a storytelling point of view, I think it's more powerful to put that scene there. And that meant that actually that's the way I wrote it as well. So if I felt right today, I want to write a scene where she's, you know, in the winter in Siberia, then I would write that scene. And the next day I might feel like writing a scene where she's in New Zealand, in a sort of very small social situation. So it allowed me that creativity too, which was a real change from starting on page 1 of chapter 1 and keep going till you finished it.
So what was the writing process like beyond that? So how long did it take you to write the book and to do the research, I suppose, beforehand as well?
A long time. Well, what I consider a long time, I think it must have been about 5 or 6 years. I write historical fantasies. It's commercial fiction, and I love writing it, and I've written 2 different series of books, and I have obligations for that work. So I have contracts, I have deadlines, I have work schedules to fit into what I do. It's my living. So I would sort of find like 2 or 3 months between books and spend that time with Kate, and then go and write another book, and then come back and spend a few more months, and in between I'd be reading a bit more, researching a little bit more, but I couldn't write it at the same time as my commercial fiction. I had to eventually carve out 6 months to finish it, but I'd been writing it in small bits. And again, I don't think that's why I wrote it in such a fragmented way, but I think it was helpful that it was like that. Because in the end it was easier to sort of go in and out of it. But it meant that it did take quite a long time, and then it's been published with Honor Press, who are a brilliant Welsh publishing house, and they're a very small press, and it takes time for them to turn the book around, so that made the whole process maybe a bit slower as well, but it was slower. Normally I'd write a book in a year.
And I know you write other books in different genres as well. How long have you been writing for?
Professionally, since my first novel was published in 2009.
Okay,
so 10 years, And before that it took me 9 years to get my first novel published, but I was writing short stories and non-fiction things. But I've been a full-time professional writer for 6 years now.
Another thing I wanted to talk to you about was the title, and sort of what the title means to you. Because I really like the title, and I think especially when you read the book you understand why it is what it is. But I just wondered how you came up with that title and what you thought of it.
I came up with the title while I was writing the book. It was one of those titles that was sort of, you know, how when you're reading a book, as you say, as a reader, and you suddenly think, that's why it's called that.
Yes.
Well, I sort of had that moment while I was writing it. I thought, oh, that's what I'm going to call it, which was a relief because I wasn't sure. And it's really because one of the themes of the book is about acceptance. It's about, for instance, the lepers are cast out of their society, their villages and their homes. People don't accept them as part of their community anymore because they're frightened of them. Same-sex relationships were unacceptable. Kate doesn't accept herself as she is. And actually she's quite happy to tell people, you know, these are God's children, these lepers that you cast out to die. he loves them, we must look after them. But it takes Rose to tell her that means you too.
Yeah.
You know, you are as you are, and if, you know, because of your faith you believe he created you like that, why would he not accept you?
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, we all want to fit in one way or another, and I think she never achieved that. She never managed to fit in anywhere. And so that title sort of reflected that to me. As a nurse, she was trying to educate the communities, but she knew that was beyond her. A hospital was one thing, but to completely change the mindset of the culture was not something she could do.
Well, another thing I think about the book sort of makes Kate not exactly an outcast, but it's not just her sexuality, but also her gender. She's doing these expeditions, which people are scandalised that she's the only woman with all of these men going with her, and she's riding in trousers and things like that, which I think is really, really interesting to read from one perspective and see kind of what she could do and what she did do, but also the reaction to it.
Yeah, I mean, she really was, she could never get it right, because if she wasn't gay, then what was she doing with all those men? Obviously she was, you know, promiscuous and a loose woman, and so and as you say, she wore trousers, and she just explains when she's fundraising for the trek that, you know, they're very small, these little Siberian ponies that she rode, and they're quite wild, and there's no way she would have stayed on them sitting side saddle. There weren't any side saddles, you know, she had to trek through forests with very narrow paths. They had to escape bears, they had to escape wolves, you know, they went through ice. She had to just cling on like everybody else and wear trousers, and she couldn't have done it otherwise. But then they would say, well, then you shouldn't be out there, you know, why were you going? Send somebody else. So, but yeah, she was not a normal person of her time. I think she'd have been extraordinary now. But then she was, very much so.
Yeah, definitely a really fascinating person. I was going to ask you, even beyond God's Children, what other historical authors you like and what your favourite historical novels are?
Well, there's so many. I vividly remember reading Restoration by Rose Tremaine when it first came out, which was about 1989, something like that, and it absolutely blew my mind. It completely changed the way I thought of historical fiction. I'd always completely wrongly thought of historical fiction as either rather dry or sort of bodice rippers and romances set in, you know, with a lot of frills and stuff. And it wasn't like that at all. I suddenly thought, look what you can do, look what you can do. And it was a female writing a male character, and that was a revelation to me as well, how wondrously she inhabited this character and how vivid he was and how bawdy the whole thing was. And another of my favourite books has always been Candide by Voltaire, which is obviously, you know, 17th century, a bit older. But again, that idea of that historical fiction can be, whether it's contemporaneously historical or historical from our point of view now, it doesn't have to be either of those other two things. It is so open as to what you can do and how you can use it. And the other person who really makes me feel that is David Mitchell. A Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet is a wonderful book.
It's on my shelf. I haven't read it yet.
You'll love it.
No, I'm sure I will.
I mean, it's not as structurally complicated as Cloud Atlas. There's no sci-fi.
I do love it.
Okay, don't have to deal with the sci-fi, but it's a beautifully written book. I love his books. The other person I read a lot is Andrew Miller.
Oh yeah,
I love Pure, which I think won the Costa, didn't it, a couple of years back?
I've read Now We Should Be Entirely Free, which I'm really
just
really
finished
like.
that too.
Great.
They're really lovely books, and they're so different, and yet they're all sort of classed as historical fiction. So those are some of my favourites.
Yeah, so I think that is mostly what we wanted to talk about today, which is exciting. Mabli also writes under the name Paula Braxton, and she has a YouTube channel as well where she talks about writing, so I'm going to link that down below, and I'll also link down below God's Children on Goodreads, and I'll also link down below Hono Press, who are the publishers. Hono are a really fantastic Welsh press, and they publish a lot of amazing fiction. They also publish like out of print Welsh classics by female writers. I have read some of their Victorian stuff before, which is fantastic, so I'd highly recommend checking them out as well. And that is all for today. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks, Mabli, for being here, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.
Thank you. Bye.